This is part 2 of the 3-part coffee table series. One of the corners turned out great, a couple of them turned out okay, and one looked terrible. I decided that the way I'd solve this problem was to cut off the corners and put kind of a wedge piece in each one, and that would make the overall table like a really sort of out of proportion octagon, where each of the corners is a very small flat surface. Initially I used a handsaw guided by a square that I had clamped to the trim. At first this seemed like a good idea, but it was quite a bit of work, and when I actually got done with it I realized that the results weren't great. It was pretty straight, but not as good as I wanted. I ended up switching over to use a router to cut the corners, which would give me a much straighter and more consistent edge. I still use the square on the trim just to make sure everything lined up, and then I very carefully made a pass with a straight bit, and I had to use my foot to keep the table from rocking too much, but this ended up working out pretty well. I decided I wanted a longer cord to work with the router just to make it easier to move, so I unplugged one of my lights and plugged the router into that extension cord. And then the router didn't turn on. I tried it in a few different outlets, but the router was just dead. It would no longer work. So I guess it was back to cutting by hand. This time I decided to score the wood very, very heavily to try to get enough of an indentation to make sure my saw would be as straight as possible. As hard as I pressed and as deep of a cut as I initially made with a sharp knife, this didn't make a whole lot of difference, and the resulting cut was just not as good as what I could do with the router. I decided to take the router apart and see if I could figure out what was wrong with it. It took a while, but I realized that the main power switch was just completely full of sawdust. I thought it would be as easy as just cleaning this out and reconnecting, but that didn't work, so I ended up having to order a new switch. The switch ended up being delivered during halftime on a Sunday, so I went into the garage, put it in the router, and everything was working again. Once the game was over, I routed each of the corners, including rerouting the ones that I had done by hand, so I had a nice, flat, even surface for all of them. Once those were ready, I just cut a bunch of pieces out of the scrap from what was left over from cutting the trim before, and I wasn't very precise. I just made a bunch of different approximate triangular pieces. Then I just figured out which ones fit. I put glue in place and tacked them in. They didn't have to be perfect because I was just going to sand everything flush afterwards anyway. I decided to hammer in the brads that had held the trim in just a little bit, and then I could add some glue into that hole, and when I sanded the trim to get it to have a nice surface, some of that sawdust would also go into that glue and hopefully cover up the nail holes just a little bit. When sanding the trim, I realized that the legs were a bit more rough than I had realized in a few spots, despite that I had sanded them before. I guess I had brushed too much, so I went ahead and sanded those again. With the trim finished and the legs sanded yet again, it was time to put the bottle caps on. This was a very tedious process that took quite a while, but I got through it all. I just wish that I had been a little bit more careful with the way that I lined up some of the bottle caps, especially near the end. I started out kind of picky about making sure things looked good and everything was even, and by the end I got pretty sloppy. thought it'd be a good idea to put on one coat of wipe-on poly before I got to the epoxy, and I was really amazed with how much this made the grain pop out. The walnut looked amazing. The next day I masked off the top of all the trim just to keep it safe from any epoxy I might drip or if I poured a little too much. I figured this was my last chance to make sure all the bottle caps were how I wanted them to be, so I took a level and used it as a straight edge just to find any bottle caps that were a little bit high. One of the problems using the little 1/4 inch spacers in each of the bottle caps is that those pieces weren't completely even, so some bottle caps stuck up a little bit more or were a little bit crooked. The epoxy I was using is mixed in just a simple 1-to-1 ratio, but this is ideally done when it's maybe 70 degrees in the environment versus the 40 or so it was in my garage. This might take a while. I poured the first batch of epoxy down and quickly saw that I would need a whole lot more, so I mixed up another batch and poured it down as well. With that second batch down, I used a heat gun to help clear out any bubbles that were in the epoxy, as well as warm it up enough so it would spread out a little bit more evenly. It was just a matter of repeating this process of adding some epoxy and using the heat gun to help clear out the bubbles and spread it around, and just continuing to repeat this over and over. But one problem I ran into that's very obvious in hindsight is that since I used hot glue to glue the bottle caps down, some of them became warm enough while I was heating the epoxy that they floated to the surface. So I used a extra scrap of wood to kind of push those down and hold them in place for a little bit so that they would get stuck back in place. This wasn't the ideal solution, but you live and learn, I guess.
It's close, but I ran out of epoxy, so I need to pick up some more of that. And I feel like I've been in the garage for weeks now. I need to shave. Getting pretty rough. I'm having nightmares about my tools coming after me, and nothing seems to be going my way. So I think now I need to take a little bit of a break from this project, do some cleanup, and we'll see what comes next. Hopefully it's something good.
Unfortunately, one section of the epoxy turned out really badly and I needed to figure out how to fix it. So I decided to build a miniature table, sort of mimicking what I had built at a smaller scale, and then I could pour epoxy on it and experiment with different ways of fixing problems. One of the things I did differently with this was rather than cut out little wood spacers under each of the bottle caps, I filled them with wood glue and gave them a couple of days to completely dry, and then I could glue that wood glue chunk down, and that actually worked really well. So if I were redoing the whole table, I would do that instead of those stupid spacers. Now that I have my test piece ready, I can try a few different ways of fixing a portion of it. First, I'm going to start with a chisel. That's definitely not going to work. That causes very large cracks. So we'll try something different. Let's try a Dremel. All right, now with the dust mask on, I can try it. Good to wear a dust mask. All right, so the last thing I'll try is just sandpaper. I'm going to pretend there's some bubbles here, sand it down a bit, then I'll clean everything off and see what happens when I apply more epoxy. Yet another day has passed on this project, and the sample piece is ready to take a look at. And I'll show that up close, but basically the sanded portion, you can't tell at all that it was sanded and fixed. The other parts you can see very clearly, and they look really bad. So next I'm going to experiment with cutting out sections and sanding around that to see if I can potentially remove sections and sand the edges to still get a natural finish. This first part here, I sanded down the edges to try to get it a little bit more smooth to see if the epoxy filling in there ends up blending in well. I didn't worry about these edges. Along this side, I just sanded in quite a bit just to see how that would work. I'll need to clean up these kind of little bits that are sticking on here, but that shouldn't be too bad. And then in the center here, I sanded down and made a nice ramp, so this is a real easy slope, and hopefully the epoxy adheres really well to this. And we'll see this edge here is a little bit more steep than the rest, but I think it should work out. Well, a couple days have passed and the test piece has solidified. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but the right side looks pretty bad. You can see where it was chipped and you can see some of the rough spots. The left side looks absolutely terrible. And the middle mostly looks okay. You can see there are a few high spots where this kind of chunk was taken out. So I think what I'm going to do is just try to sand the table down and put on another layer and see what happens.